prisoners. And it was about his stint of army duty in the occupied territories. And at one point, Goldberg recalls a conversation he's having with a Hamas member, and he says to the Hamas member, "For God's sake, we don't try to kill children." That's supposed to be the difference. Hamas tries to kill Israeli children, whereas Israel doesn't try to kill Palestinian children. It's an accident. So, what does the record show? 878 Palestinian children have been killed during the Second Intifada. That's more than the total number of Israeli civilians killed, 705, of whom 119 have been children. And the ratio of children, it's been about 8-1. For every 8 Palestinian children killed, 1 Israeli child has been killed. So, our preliminary conclusion would be, for the want of trying to kill Palestinian children, it would seem that Israelis were awfully good at it. Is it even true? Is it even true that Israel doesn't deliberately kill Palestinian children? Well, that's not what the human rights reports show. Amnesty International says that on many occasions, Israel has deliberately targeted Palestinian demonstrators who are overwhelmingly children. And then it goes on to say that Israel indiscriminately, excessively, and disproportionately fires on Palestinian children. In fact, one simple statistic: of the 37 Palestinian children killed in the first month of the Second Intifada, September 30th through October 31st, of the first 37 Palestinian children killed, fully 20 died from a direct bullet shot to the head. That's deliberate killing. Well, what about indiscriminate killing? Is indiscriminate killing different than deliberate killing? In fact, under international law, it's not. Under international law, the foreseeable and inevitable consequences of an act count as intention. I know that sounds a little abstract and people are ready to tune me out, but in fact it's not difficult to understand at all. Let me repeat. The foreseeable and inevitable consequences of an action count as your intention. What does that mean? If somebody nukes an anthill, it's redundant to ask, did you intend to kill the ants? The inevitable and foreseeable consequence of nuking an anthill is ants are going to be killed. You don't have to ask what the intention is. And the same way, if Israel indiscriminately fires artillery into a civilian neighborhood and kills civilians, that's no different under international law than if you deliberately target civilians. And there are Israelis who perfectly well understand this principle. Take the case of the outstanding Israeli journalist Gideon Levy. He writes for Haaretz, and he covers the occupied territories. And in November 2006, when Israel was indiscriminately firing artillery into civilian neighborhoods of Gaza, Mr. Levy had this to say: someone who throws burning matches into a forest can't claim he didn't mean to set it on fire. And anyone who bombards residential neighborhoods with artillery can't claim he didn't mean to kill innocent inhabitants. Therefore, it takes considerable gall, says Mr. Levy, and cynicism to dare to claim that the Israeli army did not intend to kill inhabitants of Beit Hanun. Notice his choice of words. When you indiscriminately fire into a civilian neighborhood, that is no different at all than the deliberate targeting of a civilian neighborhood. They both count as intention. Even Israel's leading authority on international law, a fellow by the name of Yoram Dinstein, a very smart guy from Tel Aviv. He's the president of Tel Aviv University. Unfortunately, when it comes to issues bearing on Israel, he is a hack, but he's very smart. And in his standard study of international law, he writes, and I'm quoting him, "There is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians, which is what Hamas is accused of, and reckless use of force, which is what Israel is accused of." To quote him, they are equally forbidden. And therefore, the conclusion you reach is the only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are, first, Israeli terrorism is about 3 or 4 times as lethal or deadly as Hamas terrorism, and 2, no demand, let alone sanctions, has been imposed on Israel to renounce terrorism. Well, if you apply the principle of opposing terrorism to only one side, it's not a moral principle. It's simply an exercise in hypocrisy. Well, some of you are perhaps willing to go with me this far. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but I did quote Mr. Dinstein, Mr. Levy. It sounds right. But even if everything I say is true, what about resolving the conflict? Isn't that complicated? And how can I pretend it's not? Because were it not complicated, wouldn't it be resolved already? It's already 40 years. In fact, there's been a consensus in the international community for about 3 decades now how to resolve this conflict. And everyone in this room knows it. It's called the two-state settlement. The two-state settlement means a full withdrawal from the territories Israel conquered in the June 1967 war. In accordance with that principle, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Then there's also another fundamental principle of international law, namely every state, member state of the United Nations, has the right to be free from the threat or use of force. Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Therefore, the neighboring Arab states have to recognize Israel's right to be free from threats or use of force. And thirdly, the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with East Jerusalem should come into being, that being the two-state settlement of the conflict. Not particularly controversial, doesn't raise any complicated questions of international law so far as I could tell. And in fact, that's the opinion of the entire world community. We know that. That's not speculation. It's not my opinion. It's what the record shows. What record? Everyone in this room can check for him or herself. All you have to do is go to the computer, go to Google, and enter the words peaceful settlement of Palestine question. And when you enter those words, peaceful settlement of Palestine question, what will come up on your screen is the annual vote in the United Nations General Assembly. Every year in November and December, they vote on the two-state settlement. And the vote is 1989, 151 to 3. The whole world on one side, the United States, Israel, and Dominica, the island state of Dominica, on the other side. I don't have time to go through the record for 30 years. I'll just quickly give you the vote. 1997, check for yourself, 155 to 2. 1998, 154 to 2. 2002, 160 to 4. 2003, 160 to 6. 2004, 161 to 7. 2007, 161 to 7. Now, those of you whose critical faculties are activated, you noticed that the number, no doubt you noticed, leaped from 2 to a phenomenal 7. And it is true, there has been that quantum leap from 2 to 7. It's slightly more underwhelming when you realize that the 7 are typically every year. Check for yourself. The United States, Israel, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. That's it. Now, for those of you who are slightly humiliated, embarrassed by the fact that you're college educated and you've never heard of Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu, if it's any consolation, the combined populations of those mighty states could fill the empty seats in this room with plenty of room left over. In fact, more room left over than we would like to think, because due to global warming, Tuvalu won't be with us much longer. Actually, no, don't clap for Tuvalu. No. Because the truth is Tuvalu dropped out. In recent years, it's no longer joined with the U.S. and Israel, and I think it's because of the global warming. I understand they've been a leader in supporting the Kyoto Protocol. And that's been the case, literally, it's been the case for the past nearly now 40 years. So let me quote to you one of the leading specialists in international law, a fellow named Quincy Wright. And this is what he writes in 1970, well before half of this room was even born. He writes, in view of the acceptance of UN Resolution 242, the main resolution, the Israel-Palestine conflict, by the adjacent Arab states except Syria, the major obstacle to progress seems to be the refusal of Israel to do so and to agree to withdraw from occupied territories. That's 1970. You fast forward to last year, 40 years later nearly, you open up Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, and what's his conclusion? Peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when Israel is willing to comply with international law by accepting its legal borders. The same problem 40 years ago is the same problem today. That's the obstacle